Hi, welcome to our next, stand-in kind of confused me a little bit. I'm Christine Montrexel with the Lupus Foundation of Northern California, and we're here today with Rashida Glock to discuss clinical trials with you. Rashida, sorry, it's one of those days for me today. Rashida is with Aurinia Pharmaceuticals, who is also one of our sponsors. But just so you know, this has nothing to do with anything funding related. This is specifically clinical trials, and this is to bring you information on how you can get involved and what you can do. So I am going to let Rashida introduce herself and tell you a little bit about clinical trials, and then we'll go into some of your questions. So, all right?
Thank you.
There you go.
Thanks, Christine. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about clinical trials. Just a little bit of background. I have about 25 years of clinical experience in clinical trials and clinical operations, and so I'm really excited to be able to be here and answer any of your questions about clinical trials, what they are, how to get involved. And so we have a whole list of questions, which is fantastic, and I'm looking forward to being able to answer any of your questions that come through. But before we start, I wanted to maybe take a little bit of an opportunity here to talk about different phases of clinical trials, just so you have an understanding of the process from the drug development from the lab all the way through to when you can get a drug at the pharmacy. So basically in clinical trials and in the process of drug development, you have your basic research where you work in the lab, looking at the compounds, trying to understand and develop this potential treatment. It gets through a lot of research in the lab before it goes into animal testing. It does happen in animal testing from time to time, moving through the process before it goes to human trials. In human trials, the first clinical trial happens in what we call phase 1, which is usually healthy volunteers. And these are studies that look at how the treatment or the potential treatment is absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted. Basically how it moves through your body and what happens. And these can be very, very small studies with maybe a handful of volunteers. And then we're looking at basic safety and, again, like I said, how the drug moves through the body. Then it moves into phase 2. And in phase 2, clinical trials we've already established that there's a safety component there. We want to expand that into looking at further safety, as well as a dose ranging. What is the best dose with the most efficacy, which means it works the best, but has the least amount of side effects for humans in this particular condition. And that study period can be a shorter time period, it can be a longer time period. It's usually more patients that come through, but not a huge number. And then when you move through phase 2, looking at safety, it goes into phase 3, where you have much bigger numbers. You usually have many more sites. Sometimes many different countries are involved, and this is looking at the disease indication, it's looking at safety, it's looking at how the drug works in terms of efficacy. Does it work well? And as well looking at any kind of side effects in the population that is being studied. After phase 3, it usually at that point in time can go to an application for FDA or a regulatory agency approval. And there it will go, if everything works well and it gets approved, out to the pharmacy and available to the public. Now that sounds like a lot of things happening in a relatively short period of time, but that entire process can take many, many, many years. It can take up to 7, maybe even 10 years for that whole entire process to happen. And in between each phase of a study, there are review cycles where agencies like the FDA will review each study very, very closely and approve the further development to the next phase. So there is a very long process, and it is a stepwise fashion to make sure that when drugs get developed, they're developed in a way that is the most safe to the public, and you make sure that you get the best drug, the best treatment possible. So those are the phases of clinical trials, and I know I went through it very, very quickly, but we can, if there are any other specific questions about phases of clinical trials, we can talk about that as well.
And that's what I was just going to remind all of our viewers about, is that we are taking questions online. So if you have any questions for Rashida, go ahead and submit them in the comments below, and we'll answer them for you there.
Fantastic.
So, do you want to start on some of our questions that we did receive, or do you want to keep going in?
Absolutely. We'll jump right into some of the questions. So one of the first questions was, how do you find out about clinical trials? And that's a fantastic question. The first thing I would say is ask your doctor, because a lot of times your physicians will know about clinical trials that are happening, and if they are not sure about clinical trials and you want to do some research to find out yourself about clinical trials, there are websites that you can go to and do some research on your own. A fantastic resource is clinicaltrials.gov, and that has all clinical trials, all manner of clinical trials. In the search bar, you can type the disease that you're looking for. So for example, if you were to go to clinicaltrials.gov and type in lupus in the search bar, you'll see all of the different lupus trials that are either recruiting or have finished recruiting or maybe starting up. So that is a fantastic way to find out about clinical trials, and usually on those websites where the studies are, it will be able to link you to where you can learn a little bit more. And of course, you can also go to different websites like the Lupus Foundation of Northern California. Their website also links a lot of different clinical studies, and you can find out more about the different trials there.
And our website, just for your information, is www.lfnc, as in
Larry, Frank, Nancy, Charlie.
Larry, Frank, Nancy, Charlie.org.
Fantastic. So the next question was, what are the requirements to get involved in a clinical trial? So every single clinical trial is a little bit different. So there are things called inclusion-exclusion criteria or eligibility requirements, and it depends on what is being studied. So the requirements, first and foremost, of every single trial always is making sure that there is informed consent. And what informed consent means is that you have the opportunity and the ability to understand exactly what is happening in that clinical trial. There is a form called an informed consent form. It tells you all about the study. It tells you the purpose of the clinical trial. It tells you a bit about the study drug or treatment. It tells you if the study treatment is being compared to another treatment or maybe to a placebo, which is also known as a sugar pill. And it tells you about what you can expect in that clinical study, how many visits you would need to come to. It tells you about the risks. It tells you about the benefits. It tells you absolutely everything. And with an informed consent, you can read the informed consent, you can ask any questions, and you can have that opportunity to take it home and talk to your family, talk to loved ones, talk to whomever you want to learn a little bit more about the study before you actually go in to this trial.
How do HIPAA regulations, do they apply to clinical trials?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So your personal information is not shared outside of the clinical trial site. So there are also there are HIPAA regulations, and that you would make sure that your site would have all of that information, and your personal information does not get shared externally. So when you are in a clinical trial, everything is anonymized. So you would have a subject number or a subject code, and that's how you would be identified. So your study doctor and the study team would know who you are, but your information that goes into the database is not identified, and there's no way to link it back to you.
Perfect.
So that's what the sites have. So as I've mentioned, every single study is different. All of the eligibility requirements are different. Oftentimes there is a screening period where you would have to determine if you are eligible, if you would meet the inclusion or exclusion criteria for that particular study. And that gets, you get walked through that by your study doctor or the study nurse and the study team.
Do you have to be in a flare to be considered for a clinical trial?
Not necessarily. It depends on the clinical trial. So some clinical trials require people to be in an active flare, in the case of lupus nephritis, for example, but sometimes they don't. Different studies, like I said, have different requirements, and you really need to see which study actually fits best for you, because there are an awful lot of clinical studies out there.
Okay, great.
So another question is, can you choose which trials to participate in, or do you need to be referred by a doctor? And the answer is, in clinical studies, always, you have the choice 100%. So you can be referred by your doctor if your doctor is aware of the different studies and thinks, this might be a good fit for you. But also, you don't have to enter into a clinical trial if you don't want to. You can be in a clinical trial and you can change your mind at any point in time. The choice is 100% yours. It is completely voluntary. So when you are interested in a clinical trial, you can choose that trial. However, that goes without saying that you still need to actually be eligible for that trial. So if you're choosing to go down the path to learn about a specific trial, you would still need to determine if you're eligible and you meet the criteria to enter into that study.
So I have one quick question before we move on to the other ones. Is there a different or a fast-track process to repurposing drugs?
I'm not 100% familiar with the specific regulations around fast-track for repurposing drugs. I know that there is a lot of work that's being done in repurposing drugs with different groups, but I'm not 100% familiar with that.
That's great. Thanks.
Okay.
So next we have, we went over requirements?
Yeah, there's another question here about what are the pros and cons of participating in a clinical trial. Now that's a big one. What are the pros and cons? Well, first of all, the information about a clinical trial, like I said, is always found in the informed consent, and that will tell you about the risks and the benefits of that particular investigational treatment, and as well about the study. So some of the pros is that you have access to treatment that may not be available to anybody else at that particular time. Another pro is that you're helping to further research. You're helping to further learn, scientists, researchers learn about the disease, about what can help, and also you're helping potentially get a new drug to market depending on the outcome of the clinical trial. So these are pros. You also get to have a lot of follow-up and care from the study site. You have access to the study doctors, to the study nurses, and so you get a lot of care, and that's oftentimes something that's very nice. Some of the cons of participating in a clinical trial: some clinical trials take up a lot of time. I mean, some clinical trials require you to visit the site quite a few times, and that may not be very easy depending on what's going on in your life. So that is a con. It is usually an investigational product, so there may be risks to the investigational treatment, but that, like I said, is usually outlined in the informed consent. So, there are lots of pros and cons, and we can talk a little bit more about it if you have any specific questions.
If you are accepted in a clinical trial, our next question was, will your medical be paid? And in addition to that, what about transportation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. If you are accepted into a clinical trial, all of the procedures usually are covered. So the medical, your medical insurance or whatever would not be billed. So if you have treatments, if there are additional medications, all of that's covered as part of the clinical trial. Any of the procedures, the labs, if you had to have an ECG or any of the other medical procedures, and the care from the physicians are also covered. So you're not paying for that out of pocket.
So are you saying that even your present course of treatment is covered?
So
what you're already
it depends. It depends. So if you're in a clinical study, usually you are able to, the medication that you are going to be given will be covered. So if you are taking other meds for other conditions, hypertension or something else, those aren't covered. The study medications are covered.
And do you also need to be seeing your regular doctors in addition to the doctors in the clinical trials?
It's always a good idea to make sure that your regular physician is aware that you're in a clinical trial. Okay. Because if you need to change your medications, your background medications, if you have something going on, it's always good to know that you are in a clinical study, and that they can, if they have any questions, they can talk to the study doctor, as well as if there are potential interactions with the medications that you're taking. It's always good to make sure that your study doctor or your regular doctor knows that you're in a study trial.
Perfect. That's good to know.
So the procedures will be paid. You had a question. You asked about transportation.
Transportation. We have some patients who had mentioned that they would be interested in participating in clinical trials, but they don't drive or they don't have, adequate transportation.
Right, and that is something that, oftentimes comes up. And many clinical trials, not all, but many clinical trials do cover the costs of transportation to help patients come to the clinic. Sometimes there is a stipend for to reimburse for things like transportation or maybe some food or something like that if the visits are very long. But every single trial is different. So I can't say that it is the same across the board, but it is something that is routinely and offered, and it's best to learn about that when you're looking at the informed consent, and that would all be detailed in every single study's informed consent.
Perfect. And we touched on that a regular medical wouldn't be paid, but can you leave trials at any time?
Absolutely. So clinical trials are voluntary, so you can change your mind at any time, and it doesn't impact your the regular medical care that you're entitled to. So if you decide that the clinical trial is just not working for you, or you don't have the time to commit to it anymore, you can leave, and you do not have to give a reason. You should let the study physician know, of course, but
but there's no repercussions.
There's no repercussions. There's no repercussions. It's up to you because it is 100% voluntary.
Perfect. And then we had a question about if a person is in a placebo group, will they be given a new treatment at the end of the trial? So once the trial ends, if they are in the group that doesn't receive the medication, are they eligible to receive that?
That is a very good question, and sometimes yes, sometimes no. It really depends on the trial. So it's a little bit more complicated than if you were in a placebo group first, and then you would get treatment afterwards. When a study is over, there's an analysis of the study to determine, did it work? If the study didn't work, if the treatment didn't work the way that everyone was hoping it would work, then clearly you would not have you may not want to have access to that. There are sometimes opportunities to be able to go into extension studies where you would be able to get additional treatment after the study is over. But it really depends on the clinical study. It depends on the sponsor. It depends on the phase of treatment.
Okay, great. And let's see. Will you be notified of the results of the trials?
Yes, so notification of the results when studies are over there is a process that happens. So you may not, if you're enrolled into a study, and the study may be 6 months, it may be 12 months, it could be 2 years. It depends again on the study. There's an awful lot that happens by the time you're finished the study. All of the volunteers, all of the subjects in the study would have to finish the study. Then the database would be locked. Then the data would be analyzed. And then only at the time when everything is unblinded so that the results are available and published, then it goes to the study doctor. So at that point in time, the study doctor should be contacting the volunteers that were in the study, and you would have access to find out whether you were on treatment or placebo, if there was a placebo or not. And
oh, we're back. Sorry about that. We experienced a little bit of technical difficulties, but we are back. Sorry about that. So we'll continue on with I forgot where we just were.
I think we were talking about you can leave trials at any time. Oh yes,
do you have access to the results of the study?
Oh, no.
Do you want to summarize that one more time, just a little bit, since we did kind of cut out?
That maybe.
Absolutely. So we were talking about if you would be notified of the results when a clinical trial is finished, and the answer is yes, you would be notified of the results. It takes a while for the results to be analyzed. Once the results are available, the study doctors are made aware of the results, and then your study doctor would let you know whether you were on placebo or on study medication or the general results of the trial.
I have a question. If you are on a medication and it works for you, and the medication does not go through the approval of the FDA, what happens then?
That's a very good question. I don't.
Sorry.
No, it's actually a very good question. Hopefully, if a medication works for you and it doesn't go through the FDA, that medication at that point in time would not be available. That being said, it doesn't mean that it may not be further, studied later on or in a different way to try again. So there are different steps. And, like I said, at each phase, there is a review cycle with the FDA to talk about the results and give some direction in terms of moving forward to approval.
So one of the other questions, too, was we talked about care and the doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Who is in charge of your care while you're on a clinical trial? Who's the main doctor that you're going to want to go to?
So the principal investigator, the main study doctor. So if you are in a clinical trial, you usually have your principal investigator, which is the main physician. There may be a sub-investigator, and these are physicians that work for the principal investigator who may see you and do some procedures. And there are also study coordinators or study nurses that you may also see. But overall, the main person who is responsible is the principal investigator at that clinical trial site.
Okay, great. And we've touched on the information that when you're in the trial, your information is still private after the trials are released.
Correct.
So we've got that. Is there any long-term follow-up, and how is it done if there is?
So again, that really depends on the clinical study because there are so many different clinical studies. Some studies, there will be a long-term, or there could be a long-term follow-up component, and that could be anything like having you come back into the clinic to ask for something or to get some additional procedures done. It may be a phone call, it may be different types of access, but regardless of whatever way that follow-up is done, it's again always included in the informed consent. So in the study consent, it would say that you would agree to be contacted for longer term follow-up, and again, you could change your mind. You can start saying, yes, I'm interested, but then after a while, if you didn't want to be, you could say, I no longer want to be contacted.
And along that lines, what happens to their care after the trial ends? Do they just go back to their regular doctors? How does that?
Again, it depends. Usually you go back to your regular doctor. If you have ongoing care with the principal investigator, then you would just be followed as you would normally be followed by your physicians.
Perfect. So are there any dietary guidelines for participants in any given trials?
Again, it
It's
always changes depending on the clinical trials. Some clinical trials will say, for example, a very common one is maybe you can't eat anything before you come into the site. For example, if you're giving blood and you need to be in a fasting state. So that happens a lot. But in terms of dietary guidelines, what foods you can eat or you cannot eat will depend on the study drug being researched. It may depend on the study itself, and sometimes there aren't. It may depend on the phase of clinical trials.
Perfect. And then I'm looking over our questions, and I think we've covered a lot of them. But do you want to go into any more detail about how important clinical trials are? I know that there's a lot of people interested that are nervous.
Yeah, I think, joining a clinical trial is not always an easy decision. It's not an easy decision. There is a lot of consideration that should be applied because it's an important decision. It's not necessarily an easy decision, but it's an important decision. What I always recommend is when you're looking at becoming involved in a clinical trial, that you do your research, you go on clinicaltrials.gov, you look at the different studies that are available. As I've mentioned, there are pros like being able to access treatment that is not necessarily available otherwise. But every single time there is an informed consent. And I can't stress enough how important the informed consent is because it tells you everything about the study. And you can take that informed consent, you can take it home. You can, there isn't a timeline for you to make a decision. So you can take that informed consent home, you can discuss it with your family, you can discuss it with whomever you want, maybe, your pastor or your siblings or your best friend, and talk about it and, really, really decide, is this right for you? And also talk to your own doctor, who may not be the study doctor. And that information, when you have that, then you can really make an informed decision as to whether or not you want to participate.
We have a question about negative effects of the drugs. Mm-hmm. What happens if you do experience something out of the ordinary when you're going through a clinical trial?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you go into a clinical trial and you see the study team, whether it's the study nurse or the study doctor, they will always ask you, how do you feel? Do you feel any different than you did at your last visit? And if you had any adverse events or you felt any different, they would document that. They would treat you if you needed to be treated, and you would be medically managed. So if you had any side effects or adverse events, the physicians and the nurses would make sure that you got the treatment that you needed for that particular event.
And then, can the same patient participate in more than one phase of a clinical trial?
That's also a very good question. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Again, it depends on the trial. There are times when if you've been involved in one study, you may not be eligible to go into another study with the same study drug. Sometimes not. Again, it really depends. Every single clinical trial and the study design is a little bit different, and it's always outlined in the informed consent. It sounds like I'm harping on the informed consent over and over and over again, but it really does tell you everything about the study, and it will exactly say what is allowed and what's not allowed.
So this might be more of a medical question, and you may or may not have the answer to that. So is there something about a drug that's sort of determinative about whether a patient can participate in both phase 2 and phase 3 or not?
There may not be anything specifically about it. It may be something as, it's not necessarily medical, but it may be a potential bias. Meaning, I'll give you an example. If you were participating in phase 2 and you had a very good result, something that was expected. So let's say for you developed what was expected of that particular study. If you were to go into phase 3 and you weren't behaving perhaps or developing what you had in phase 2 the same as you had in phase 3, you may think, oh, I'm not on the same thing, or the physician may think, oh, they're not on the same thing. So there may be an introduction of bias. Remembering that what we're doing in clinical trials, which is really, really important, is to collect data so that the information that becomes available is all used and analyzed in a way that will help move that medication or that potential treatment through the process in order to get approval. So everything has to be the same, and you have to try not to introduce any type of bias in that whole scientific approach.
So about the placebo group, can you explain a little bit about the different participants?
The temperature.
There you go. I don't know why we're having so many technical difficulties. Our air conditioning broke in here, so maybe that has something to do with it. My phone is just like me and does not like the heat. So we were talking about placebo, the placebo group, and what are the participants that actually take part in a clinical trial?
So again, every single trial is a little bit different, and some trials will compare the potential investigational treatment to a placebo, which is a sugar pill. Some will compare it to another type of treatment, but there's usually always a comparison arm. So the way that a potential participant gets what we call randomized to that arm is it's by chance. So you don't know, if in a case what's called a double-blind study, you don't know what you're taking, the physician doesn't know what you're taking, and so it again allows for that unbiased collection and analysis.
So the physician sometimes doesn't
The
even
physician
know.
sometimes doesn't know. Now, that being said, if the physician needed to know, because say you had a adverse event or something and the physician wanted to know what you were taking in order to manage you appropriately, there's always the ability for the physician to find out what you're taking. So usually you can, if you're randomized to placebo or to the study medication on a double-blind study, you wouldn't know what you're taking, the physician wouldn't know what you're taking, but they would have access to find out if necessary. Sometimes clinical trials are what's called open label, and that means that you know what you're taking. Some studies are placebo-controlled, meaning it's compared to a placebo or a sugar pill. Some studies are not placebo-controlled. They're compared to a comparator arm, which may be an additional, a different type of treatment or medication. And so usually you need to, in order to see if your study does what it's supposed to do or what you want it to do, it's usually compared against something else. And all the studies are different.
We have someone that's asking if anyone that has lupus can participate in trials. So they can go to theclinicaltrials.gov and look up trials on their own?
Correct.
Okay. And you don't need to consult, do you need to consult your doctor if you're looking into doing this? What's the best way to get involved in?
You don't need to consult your doctor. However, it's always recommended that you inform your doctor that you are interested in a clinical trial, or that you would like to get more information about a clinical trial. So oftentimes, if you're looking into a clinical trial and you're interested in one, you can take that information to your regular doctor, and you can talk to your regular doctor about it. You can ask their opinion if they think it might be a good fit for you or not. You can also go to the study doctor who's conducting the clinical trial and ask all the questions that you want as well. There's the opportunity there to speak to different physicians, to the study doctor and to your own doctor. I always recommend that you let your own physician know that either you're in a study, or you'd like to learn more about a study, or if you are looking at a study, give them the information, if you have that kind of relationship with your doctor, to talk about what they think about you participating.
And to get involved, like if you're say you were to tell your doctor that you're getting involved in clinical trials, oh gosh, I just forgot my whole question. I'm sorry. It's the lupus.
Are you trying to ask, like, if your doctor advises against it, can you?
Yeah, that's it. There you go.
If your doctor advises against it, it ultimately is up to you. I would suggest and recommend that you maybe find out the reason behind why he would advise against it. Also, a good thing to do is you could perhaps have your physician, your own doctor, talk to the study doctor, and that is usually very welcome by the study doctor, so that they can speak doctor to doctor and talk about your own doctor would have your medical history, could ask the study doctor about the procedures, about the investigational treatment, and be able to decide or help you decide if it's really a good fit for you.
So on clinicaltrials.gov, they do have all the clinical trials listed for lupus. Can you contact them individually on your own?
Absolutely.
You can.
Absolutely. Usually on clinicaltrials.gov, there will be some way, it's usually at the bottom when you're reading through the study, on how to find out more about the study. So there might be a study website, there might be a phone number, a toll-free number to learn a little bit more about that particular study. But or it might be an email. There's usually some way that you can contact
them directly. Okay. And then we do have a question from Spandon. What are some of the challenges drug makers face in terms of recruitment?
That is, it's usually a big challenge. Recruitment is oftentimes a big challenge because there's a lot of misnomers about clinical trials. One, there are a lot of people that don't know about clinical trials. The exact reason why we're here, to learn a little bit more about studies, and people may not know how to get involved. So some of the issues with recruitment is, one, trying to find people that are interested in clinical trials, that want to be involved in clinical trials, that may be eligible. Depends on the type of study. Sometimes studies are really complicated, and which means it's harder to recruit because they're so complicated, and sometimes there are just not enough people that are interested, or there may be exclusionary criteria that may restrict more people to come into the study than other studies.
Is it also difficult to get a sort of a diverse group of people to participate in trials? Because lupus being one of the diseases that are predominantly happens in women, as well as women of color, some of the things we've heard is that people have a tough time recruiting women of color, for example, into these studies, especially when it comes to diseases that affect them.
Well, I think it is sometimes an issue to recruit, depending on what the disease indication is. Now, if we take lupus, for example, it is very difficult to recruit. Lupus, as you know, affects mostly young women. or even just young people that are very busy. You might have small children, you may be working. It may be very difficult to find time to get to a clinical trial site and go through the whole process. So it is difficult. It is difficult to recruit. Sometimes, because some studies are difficult to recruit, I think different pharmaceutical biotech companies, it really makes the most sense to try to do what you can do to make clinical trials as easy for people to become involved in as possible. Such things like maybe, assisting with transportation. Sometimes clinical trial sites can help out by scheduling clinic visits at a time that's a little bit more convenient. It could be after, school pickup, or early in the morning, or maybe at lunch hours, or maybe even on the weekends. These are things that people can do to make recruitment a little bit easier, because in specific areas it is oftentimes difficult depending on what's happening, and usually you should always be looking at how to make the study as easy for the patient as possible.
We have another question about if there's clinical trials if there's none in your area. I think she's joining a little bit late, so can you elaborate again? If there's studies not in your area, do they, she wants to know if they can travel for different studies.
Usually you can travel for different studies, but again, it depends on the study. So, and it depends on how far, and it depends on the site. So there's a lot of things that it depends on. If you're talking about traveling for 2 hours, usually, like if the site is 2 hours away, oftentimes you can get things like transportation reimbursed, or assistance with that. If you're talking about a farther distance or a flight, it may be a little bit more difficult. Even sites that are a few hours away, if you have your transportation reimbursed or assisted with, supported, you have to also look at that clinical study and see how many visits do you need to make. Sometimes, you could go through, halfway through, and then you find out, it's very long to travel, because I have to travel 16 times over a 1 year period, for example. But the answer is yes, it is possible. It's always something that you should discuss with the clinical trial site, because a lot of these sites have experience in working with people who may not necessarily be just local to their area.
So do these doctors in the clinical trials, do they also take into consideration your other diagnoses? Like if you have lupus and you have 6 other autoimmune diseases, will that limit the clinical trials that you can be in if you have other conditions?
Potentially. It depends on the clinical study, because that would be listed in the inclusion or exclusion criteria for the study that you're looking at. The most important part of that question is actually to make sure that you tell the study doctor or the study nurse about your full medical history. And that's why, I highly recommend that your primary care physician is informed, so that, you want to make sure that your medical history is completely up to date with your study doctor, that your primary care doctor knows what's happening, just to make sure that you're getting the best care.
And each clinical trial is different,
correct? Right?
So the amount of time for each trial would be different.
Yeah.
So, because we have people that are asking,
how long?
Yeah, people that are asking how long they have to be involved.
Yeah.
And you're not obligated to stay the entire time if you do have adverse reactions.
Right, you're not obligated to stay the whole time. However, that being said, you have to understand, if you drop out of the study or withdraw from the study, the results, the analysis doesn't get collected fully. So if you're having an adverse reaction, you have to inform the physician, the study physician, and you would be, cared for appropriately. Now, the study physician could decide your adverse reaction is, you should be withdrawn from the study, or that it's okay and that you should carry on with the study. You can always choose to leave the study whenever you want to leave the study, but also understanding that if you choose to leave the study, that you're not completing the study, which means that whatever procedures or analysis that happen after the point that you leave would not get collected, and therefore, that data would no longer be available for the overall trial, for the overall results, for the overall analysis.
Any other questions? Do you want to just discuss a little bit more about how they can get involved? I guess just a little touch on, just to review everything.
Yeah.
Because we had some people that joined late.
Okay. So to review, just as a kind of a recap, there are a lot of different clinical trials. Clinical trials are very, very different depending on the phase of the study, depending on the study itself, what's involved in the clinical study. The best way to learn about clinical studies is to ask your doctor if you're interested in the clinical study. If you want to do research on your own, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov, and that will tell you can research in the search bar lupus or whatever diagnosis, and you'll be able to have access to all of the clinical study information that's available there. And you can then go into the link, either it'll be a website or it'll be a phone number or it'll be an email address to learn more about that specific study. Every study is different. The criteria to enter into a study is different. The one thing that remains constant is the informed consent. The informed consent is a document that tells you all about the study. It tells you about the background of the study drug. It tells you about the procedures that are required. It tells you about the pros and the cons and the risks and the benefits. It tells you who to contact in the event of an emergency. It tells you everything you need to know about the clinical study. And then you can take that informed consent and spend time looking it over, talking to your physician, talking to your family or your loved ones to make a decision if you want to participate or not. If you want to participate, then you'll go into your clinical trial site and they will be able to screen, do some tests to see if you're eligible. And if you're eligible and you enter into the study, if at any time you decide you do not want to participate in the study, you can decide to withdraw from the study. That's 100% voluntary. It's 100% up to you. And that is,
and that's it
in a nutshell.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Rashida.
Thank you,
I want to thank everybody for tuning in and for watching, and I hope we answered all of your questions. I wanted to remind you that we do have a conference coming up about lupus and pregnancy. It will be at Stanford on December 2nd. You can find some information about it at our website, LarryFrankNancyCharlie.org, and find the information there. And this will be in our archive, so you can watch it any time and go back if you have questions. We'll post a link to clinical trials on our page. And we want to thank Rashida for coming all this way, because she actually flew in from Seattle to do this for us. So we're really happy that she did and honored that she was able to come. So thanks for joining us.